How dare you speak of such things?
Your Majesty.
I meant no offense.
She called him Sweet Robin. The court called them sinners. And history, for more than 400 years, has not been able to let go of the question, did Queen Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley really sleep together? That single whisper that they did has echoed through every dusty archive and gilded hall, through every painting where her eyes glance sideways and his body is just out of reach. But perhaps the real question isn't whether they did, but why we want so badly to believe they did. Why we need, century after century, to imagine the Virgin Queen wasn't so virginal after all. Why we still hunt for meaning in red petticoats, broken necks, and the letter she never let go of. They were born only a year apart. He in the year 1532. She in 1533, both into a world so steeped in betrayal that surviving childhood itself was almost a miracle. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who had her head taken by her husband, the infamous Henry VIII. Robert was the son of a man who tried to control the kingdom and lost everything. Both children grew up with death constantly circling not as a metaphor, but as a realistic, daily threat. And perhaps that's why they clung to each other like they did when you've seen people you love dragged to the scaffold. Your heart learns to grip tighter. Maybe that's what this was. Or maybe it was more. I don't think anyone who has truly loved someone in silence, who has loved from the shadowed corners of a room they weren't supposed to be in, would doubt the pain in their story. Because it wasn't just about passion. It was about impossibility. Elizabeth was Queen of England. And he, no matter how charming, no matter how tall and shapely and princely, was married. Not just married, but tied to a woman named Amy Robsart, whose fate would soon become the ghost that haunted their every dance step. When Elizabeth took the throne in 1558, Robert was there. He was always there. She appointed him Master of Horse, a position that kept him at her side constantly. They danced. They rode. They laughed, and the court watched. And whispered. And the whisper turned into talk. And the talk turned into danger. There was an old woman, just a villager, who got herself thrown into jail for saying that Robert had given Her Majesty a red petticoat, which was no innocent remark. It was Tudor slang. It meant he'd taken the Queen's virginity. And while there's no proof that they ever went that far, I keep thinking, would it matter if they had? Elizabeth swore again and again, all the way to her death in 1603, that she never let things get physical, that though she loved him with all her soul, though he was her bonny sweet Robin, they had never crossed that line. But sometimes I wonder, do people lie to others? Or to themselves? Or both? What we do know is this: in the year 1560, Amy Robsart, Robert's wife, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase with her neck broken. Some said it was cancer, that she was sick and wasted. Some said she threw herself. Others whispered of murder. But nothing was proven, and everything changed. Now Robert was free. But not really. Because Elizabeth couldn't marry a man everyone believed had just conveniently lost his wife. To do so might have meant her downfall. And so, despite the rumors, despite the years, she never married him. And yet she never let him go. One of the lines that's always haunted me is when she told the French ambassador, "I cannot do without my Lord Robert. He is like my little dog." It sounds cruel, almost degrading, but if you listen carefully, there's something desperate in it. A woman who has the world, but not the one man she wants. A queen, but not a wife. Not a lover. Not a mother. Not allowed to be anything but a symbol. She gave him gifts, titles, lands, even a castle, Kenilworth. And he, in turn, built it up with unimaginable expense just to entertain her, just to try one more time. There were fireworks she couldn't see from her window. So he had his gardeners build a pop-up display right outside. He constructed entire wings for her, planned a grand performance where, at the end, an actor would urge her to marry the host Robert himself. But it rained, and she left. And with her went the last real chance he had. Still, he stayed. Even after secretly marrying another woman, even after Elizabeth found out and exploded in fury, even after he was exiled for a time. And she refused to speak to his new wife ever again. He came back. She let him. And they resumed not lovers, not kite friends. Something more haunted than either. A connection that couldn't be named, couldn't be consummated, but couldn't be severed. He died in 1588, worn out and likely from stomach cancer. He left her one last letter. She wrote on the outside of it, his last letter, and kept it by her bedside for 15 years. Until her own death. That fact alone, that single detail says more than any scandal ever could. So here we are, pour centurilateur, still asking the same question. Did they or didn't they? And I think, perhaps, we're missing the point. The real tragedy isn't whether they shared a bed. It's that they couldn't share a life. That the world, the crown, the expectations, and the ghosts of staircases and red petticoats stood between two people who, in another time, another place might have been happy. But Elizabeth wasn't just a woman. She was England, and England couldn't afford to bleed for love. They rode side by side. The Queen in her shimmering gowns of cloth of gold, and the man she could never marry in his dark, tailored riding doublet. The two of them gliding like phantoms across England's wild fields. Her laughter trailing behind her like perfume in the wind. His eyes always on her. Always alert. Always watching. And yet never crossing that invisible threshold between power and possession. Between servitude and seduction. Between what the world would accept and what her heart most wanted. To the world, they were spectacle and scandal, pageantry and provocation. And every time their horses thundered across the same path, every time their hands touched in the dance, or their glances lingered for a beat too long beneath the torchlight, England whispered, and the whisper curdled into rumor, and the rumor hung like a storm cloud above the throne. But while the world obsessed over Elizabeth and her Robin, over the red petticoat and the locked doors and the too frequent visits, there was another woman living in silence, far from court, far from carriages and gowns and firework displays, a woman whose name history has half forgotten and whose death would become the most convenient tragedy in the most inconvenient love story of the Tudor age. Her name was Amy Robsart, and she was the wife of Robert Dudley. No one remembered their wedding with fondness, for even then, it had been called a carnal match, one begun in haste, driven by pleasure, lacking the nobility or the strategy that defined most noble unions. And though Amy was the daughter of a Norfolk squire, and though her family had land and pride, she was not a match for a man who would one day orbit the Queen's inner circle like a moon bound by gravity and doomed to burn. They were married young, and even younger were the hopes of happiness between them. For soon after their wedding vows had been spoken, the tides of ambition and politics began to shift, and Robert's eyes turned not to his wife in Oxfordshire, but to the woman who sat on England's throne, the woman who knew his childhood fears, who had laughed at his boyhood jokes, and who now wore a crown that made everything impossible and yet everything magnetic. Amy did not follow her husband to court, nor was she invited. Rumors swirled that she was sick, that she had a swelling in her breast, that her health kept her away. But others, more cynical, more brutal, whispered that Elizabeth had no desire to see the woman who had the only thing she herself could not claim, Robert's hand in marriage. Whatever the truth, Amy remained distant, increasingly isolated. As her husband's absence lengthened, his letters grew shorter, and her own heart likely fractured under the weight of abandonment disguised as royal duty. By the year 1560, the scandal had reached its boiling point. The Queen's feelings for Robert were no longer a secret, not to ambassadors, not to courtiers, not even to the common folk who gossiped in the markets and sang songs laced with barely veiled innuendo. Everyone knew Robert Dudley's wife was a problem, and some began to wonder aloud how much longer she would remain alive. And then, on a September morning that would stain his name for eternity, Amy Robsart was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in Cumnor Place. Her neck was broken. She had been alone in the house. There was no witness, no clear cause, only speculation, only the unbearable convenience of her death. And once again, the whisper returned, not of love this time, but of murder. The coroner's inquest recorded a verdict of accidental death, the result of a fall, perhaps worsened by illness or weakness. But it did little to soothe public suspicion. Some said she had been pushed, others said she had thrown herself, despair finally swallowing her hold, and a few, the boldest or the cruelest, said Robert had arranged it, or that the Queen had known. There was no proof. And yet proof was never required when a woman lay dead and another stood crowned. And between them was a man whose ambition had grown too sharp to control. For Elizabeth, Amy's death was a disaster. She had once entertained the idea, privately and carefully, of marrying Robert, perhaps even preparing for the possibility. But now, any union between them would reek of blood. And if she married him, it would look like a prize taken from the corpse of another woman. The throne was never safe, and scandal was its most persistent assassin. So she pulled back, not from Robert himself, but from the thought of ever becoming his wife. Still, she could not let him go. Still, she found ways to bring him closer, to reward him, to remind the world that he remained her favorite. He became Earl of Leicester. He received lands and titles. He was allowed into her most private chambers. He remained at her side during triumphs and defeats. Her sweet Robin, her little dog, her one impossible man. And Robert, though he mourned, though he wept at Amy's grave and begged for the rumors to stop, remained tethered to Elizabeth with invisible chains forged by decades of need and mutual dependence. Whether he loved her more than ambition, whether he felt guilt gnawing at him in the cold of night, we'll never truly know. But he stayed. He always stayed. What haunts me, what truly haunts me, is not the broken neck or the unanswered questions, not the court scandals or the diplomatic fallout, but the image of Amy alone in that house, the silence around her, the absence of her husband, the awareness, perhaps, that she had become an obstacle to something far greater than herself. Did she sense the cold gaze of fate creeping down the stairs before she fell? Did she feel her life narrowing into a single moment she could no longer stop? Or was she just a casualty of a love story she was never invited to be part of? Elizabeth never spoke publicly of Amy's death. She never offered a eulogy, never visited the grave, never whispered regret beneath a cathedral ceiling. But she did refuse Robert's offer of marriage, whether out of grief, caution, guilt, or political self-preservation. She turned him down again, and again, and again, and yet she never dismissed him. never sent him away, never truly let him go. Because in the world Elizabeth ruled, you could not be both a woman and a queen. You could not choose love without risking the crown. And so she rode beside him. For years and decades. Hearts perhaps aligned in quiet ache, but never in union. And Amy, the girl who had once worn the ring, who had once been kissed with promises, who had once dreamed of her own future, remained only as a shadow. A name, etched into suspicion. A broken body at the bottom of a staircase. No one wanted to talk about ever again, but some ghosts never leave. And in every story of Elizabeth and Dudley, in every scandal, every letter, every tear and every dance, Amy is there. Fallen, silent, and waiting. It began with a whisper, not from the mouth of a nobleman, not from a foreign diplomat or ink on parchment sealed with wax and authority, but from the cracked lips of a woman the court would never name again, an old herbalist from Brentwood, small and bent, with hands blackened by soot and years, who claimed she had heard something no subject should ever say aloud, that my Lord Robert hath given her Majesty a red petticoat. That was all. A single phrase, and yet in that handful of words lay enough scandal to rattle the walls of Whitehall and echo through the centuries. To speak of a queen's undergarments was already a dangerous game, but to say a man had given her one, a red one, was to invoke Tudor slang older than the crown itself. A coarse euphemism that every commoner in England would understand. The red petticoat meant defloration. Male séduction meant that Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, had given herself to Robert Dudley, not only in spirit, but in body, and that the body, which England called sacred, had been touched. They arrested the old woman. Of course, dragged her before magistrates, accused her of slander, of treason, of speaking foully against her sovereign. But the damage had already been done, because whispers do not die in prison. They slip through bars like breath and root themselves deep in walls. They cling to the drapes in courtly halls, to the mouths of ladies in waiting, and the ears of men who wish they were closer to the Queen than they are. The petticoat was never found. No evidence was ever produced. And yet history still remembers it. Still sees its color blood bright. Scandal red. Impossible to forget. I think about that often. How something so simple a color, a garment, a phrase could become the axis of an entire nation's hunger to see its queen fallen. And not just politically. Fallen as a woman. Unveiled. Human. It's almost as though the world could not accept that a woman might be powerful without being punished. That a woman might rule without first being ruined. So they invented the ruin. Or hoped for it. Or searched for it behind every closed door. And doors were always closing behind Elizabeth and Robert. They were always alone in chambers. In gardens. In royal coaches that bounced along muddy paths, while courtiers rode behind. Unable to hear. Only to guess. They spent more time together than was proper. More time than any unmarried man and woman in the kingdom were ever meant to cut. And though Elizabeth insisted to the end of her life that nothing unseemly ever passed between them, the rumors refused to die. Because England did not want them to die. Because rumors gave people power. In a world where truth belonged only to the crown, foreign ambassadors began sending letters home thick with codes and caution, reporting that the Queen could not sleep without Lord Robert nearby, that she grew pale when he left, that she raged when he flirted with others, that her eyes followed him like a girl's eyes and not a sovereign's. They speculated on his influence, on his rise, on whether he was more than master of the horse, on whether his hand had found its way beneath her velvet skirts in the still hours of the night. They did not need proof. They only needed to ask the question, and the question alone was poison enough. And in those poisoned words, in those letters and whispers and drunken court jests, Robert Dudley grew into something larger than life. He became the lover she never claimed, the husband she never had, the scandal she never outran. But I don't think it was lust that kept her tethered to him. I think it was something far more painful, something keener. Because Elizabeth had grown up in a world where love meant death. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had loved a king and lost her head. Her stepmothers had loved and died and been dismissed in cold efficiency. Love was not gentle. Love did not cradle. Love beheaded. Love betrayed. So perhaps Elizabeth loved Robert in the only way she knew how, by never allowing him to fully reach her. And yet, she let him close enough to hurt her. He was tall, striking, every inch the courtly ideal. They said his legs were his finest feature, long, shapely, elegant, and when they danced, the room would blur around them, the candles flickering like stars caught in the rhythm of their steps. And yet, even then, even in the music and motion, there was always that small shadow, just behind her smile, the knowledge that she could never truly claim him. Not without consequence, not without war, not without watching her image as the Virgin Queen fall to ash. So she kept him, but she did not marry him. And the court watched, and they judged. I wonder what he thought truly, when the rumors of the red petticoat spread like wildfire through the court. Was he flattered, horrified? Did he imagine her reputation collapsing? Or did he secretly hope it would? Because if the world already believed they had lain together, what difference would it make if they finally did? What was reputation compared to reality? If that reality meant holding her not as a sovereign, but as a woman. But Elizabeth was too clever for that. She knew the court better than anyone, knew that one misstep could become the stone that cracked the whole facade. And so she endured the whispers. She smiled through them. She wore her white dresses and clutched her fan and spoke coolly, as if none of it reached her. But it did. Of course it did. She was a queen, not a ghost. And even ghosts remember pain. I imagine her in her private chamber, long after midnight. The candles burned low, her face bare of the mask she wore by day. I imagine her reading one of the ambassador's letters, already opened by her spymaster. The ink still fresh, the words still biting. Her Majesty is entirely besotted with Leicester. It is widely believed he visits her at night. The Lady Amy's death has not curbed her affections, and I imagine her setting the letter down, not with rage, but with something more difficult, something hollow, the ache of knowing that no matter what she did, the world would still believe what it wanted to believe, that even in restraint, she was guilty. Even in chastity, she was tainted. And then I imagine her going to the window, looking out over the gardens he had once walked, wondering if he, too, had heard the whisper behind the door, the one that said her petticoat was red, and that the Queen was not untouched after all. It was a Sunday in early autumn, the kind of day that tries to pretend it's still summer sunlight flickering on stone. Air thick with stillness, and hedgerows beginning to brown at the edges when a servant walked into the quiet house at Cumnor Place and found Amy Robsart lying at the bottom of the staircase with her neck broken. There was no blood, no scream, no witness, only silence, and then chaos. To this day, no one knows what truly happened in that lonely country house on the 8th of September. 1560. And perhaps that's why it still haunts the corridors of power, the pages of history books, and the conscience of a woman who wore a crown but not a ring. Because Amy's death was not just a domestic tragedy, it was a political earthquake. It shattered more than a spine. It cracked the fragile possibility that Elizabeth might one day become a wife. Not just a sovereign, it turned a whispered scandal into an unburied corpse. And it gave a name, a face to the consequences of loving the wrong man at the wrong time. Amy had been alone that morning. She had insisted all her servants attend the local fair. Some protested. She insisted harder. Why she wanted to be alone? No one ever knew. Some say she planned to end her life. Some say she expected someone else to do it for her. And some believe it was coincidence, a terrible, tragic fall. The kind that happens in old houses. When one step is missed and the weight of a whole future crashes downward all at once. But there is one thing, everyone agrees on: her death could not have come at a worse moment. Because just days earlier, Elizabeth had been cautiously testing the idea of marrying Robert Dudley. It had been a delicate operation, one filled with negotiations, consultations, and the quiet planting of seeds in foreign embassies and noble households. The Queen was not reckless. She was deliberate. She knew what marriage meant. She also knew what it cost. But she was beginning to wonder, just wonder if she might risk it anyway. And then Amy died. And the hope died with her. The news reached the court like a poisoned arrow. At first, only fragments. She is dead. It was sudden. At Cumnor. A fall. But then came the rest. Her neck was broken. She was found alone. The servants had all left. And finally did the Queen know? That last question would become the knife that never stopped turning. Because no matter how loudly Elizabeth swore, she had no hand in it. No matter how convincingly Robert protested his innocence. The death was too convenient. Too perfectly timed. Too wrapped in silence. And no verdict. No inquest. No explanation could cleanse it. The coroner's jury convened. An official cause was given: misfortune. A fall. Natural. No evidence of violence. No sign of intrusion. Just a woman on the stairs. And the breaking of bone. But behind closed doors, no one believed it. Not truly. The whispers were louder than the law. Some said Amy had been depressed. That she was sick. That she had long spoken of her death as inevitable. Others said she had been helped, that someone had waited for the house to empty. Crept behind her. And given the gentlest push. And some, darker still, believed that Robert had arranged it not with his hands, but with his ambition. That he wanted to clear the path to the Queen. That love had turned into murder. Elizabeth knew what they said. She read the letters. She listened to her counselors shift in their chairs and avoid her eyes. She saw how foreign dignitaries pulled back, how marriage proposals dried up, how even her closest allies hesitated before speaking Robert's name. And she knew that if she married him now, it would ruin her. It wasn't just that Amy was dead. It was that Amy was inconveniently dead. And Elizabeth, for all her strength, could not fight the weight of suspicion. So she did the only thing she could. She stepped back. Not from Robert himself. She did not banish him. She did not break his titles or his presence at court. He remained, always remained. But she abandoned the idea of ever marrying him. Quietly. Permanently. The door closed. And it would never open again. That was the price. And yet, she did not let him go. That's what I keep coming back to, that strange, painful loyalty. Because if Elizabeth had been any other monarch, any other woman, she would have banished him, wiped her hands clean, declared the whole affair a mistake. But she didn't. She kept him close, as close as ever. as if part of her couldn't bear to lose him. Even as the rest of her knew she already had. What does it mean to love someone who has become dangerous to your legacy? I think she asked herself that question every night for the rest of her life, because even though she never wore black for Amy, even though she never visited the grave or made a public statement, even though she continued to dance with Robert, to laugh with him, to share quiet walks and glances and letters and the ache of the unspoken, she knew, deep down, that a part of her story had broken that day, and it would never fully heal. The court changed after Amy's death. The smiles became tighter, the jokes more barbed. Elizabeth's laughter rang a little hollower. Robert walked with a different weight. And though they continued as always to move through the world together, side by side, something invisible had shattered between them. The Queen could forgive many things. She forgave betrayal. She forgave ambition. But she could not forgive scandal, not when it bled so close to her skin. And so the Virgin Queen was born in full. That day. Not just a title. Not just a symbol, but a decision. A sacrifice. A shield. Because if she could not have love without consequence, she would have no love at all. And as for Robert, he would remain, he would serve, he would smile, but he would never again be the man she might have married. Because once, a woman fell down the stairs, and the entire kingdom held its breath. It had taken years to build, brick by brick, window by window. Robert Dudley had transformed Kenilworth Castle from a noble estate into a stage not just for spectacle, not just for pageantry, but for possibility. It was not merely stone and mortar, but the shape of a dream, a hope held too long. Dressed in silk and timber, gilded in gold leaf and longing, for somewhere deep beneath the towers and gardens, behind the banqueting halls and marble fountains. It was a question that had never stopped echoing. Would she ever say yes? He invited her in the summer of 1575. It was not their first meeting, not their first dance, not their first brush of fingertips behind heavy drapery, but it was the longest. 19 days. The Queen, a monarch known for her restlessness, her habit of slipping away like smoke just when her courtiers thought they could catch her, stayed nearly 3 weeks. And that fact alone sent every noble tongue wagging, every spy scratching notes into coded dispatches. Elizabeth did not stay long anywhere. Unless she wanted something, unless she felt something. And Robert made sure she felt everything. He had planned it all down to the smallest drop of wax on the candelabra. The feast, the tilt-yard tournament, the hunt, where the deer had been prepared to fall at the perfect moment, the mechanical dolphin that emerged from the lake, carrying singers with songs about loyalty and love. The castle itself had been reshaped for her. Its rooms expanded, its gardens replanted, its staircases widened. Even the walls had been stretched higher, as if trying to reach her, as if trying to catch her should she fall as another woman once had. And the fireworks, they were meant to be the crown of it all. A blaze of light above Kenilworth, visible for 20 miles in every direction, so powerful it would set the sky ablaze with color and sound. So magnificent, it would burn away the years of silence, the weight of Amy's death, the politics, the doubts, the whispers, the red petticoat, and the closed doors, and the letters that said no. Fire would say what Robert could not. Fire would ask again. But when the Queen stepped to the window on the appointed night, she saw nothing. The wind had shifted. The trees had thickened. Her view was blocked. She made a quiet complaint. Nothing dramatic. Just a small comment. Barely more than a breath. It is a shame I cannot see the fireworks. And those 10 words sent a dozen men scrambling into the night. The gardeners exhausted. mud-streaked, loyal, beyond reason worked through, until dawn, building a new display below her window. A pop-up theater of light and flame. It was madness. And it was love. Or something like it. A desperate dance for a woman who had never said yes and had never said no, who had lingered always between the two. As if her heart existed in a corridor where the doors never quite opened. I wonder what she felt. Watching those sparks rise into the dawn. Knowing the earth had been bent to her desire once more. Knowing a man had built a kingdom of light just to earn the curve of her smile. I wonder if she thought it was beautiful. I wonder if she thought it was enough. Because Robert was waiting, behind every firework, behind every curtain, behind every note played on the lute in the long galleries. There was a question, not spoken aloud, never spoken but hovering in every glance. Now, will you say it now? And he had more than just fire and architecture. He had a play, a mask, a final performance, a story that would end so carefully, so deliberately, with an actor stepping forward, holding out a scroll, and imploring the queen to marry the man who had hosted her so lavishly, so loyally, so patiently. The audience would gasp. She would smile. And perhaps she would say yes, in front of everyone, at last. But the weather turned. A storm rolled in. The show was delayed. The scroll was never read. The moment never came. And the next morning, Elizabeth saddled her horse, stepped into the saddle, and rode away. She didn't wait for the final act. And in doing so, she delivered hers. That ride, that single, silent departure, was Robert Dudley's answer. And it was not a yes. He had tried everything. He had built castles, hosted monarchs, spent fortunes, waged silence against scandal, waited through the death of his wife, the collapse of his reputation, the cold indifference of Parliament. He had laughed through the whispers, bowed through the disappointments, danced through the rumors that would not die. He had stayed, but she would not stay. Not in that way. Not in the way that mattered. And so the queen returned to her court, to her maps and ambassadors, her letters and locked boxes, her throne and solitude. And Robert remained at Kenilworth, the echoes of music fading from the halls. The gardens still heavy with trampled rose petals. The sky empty now. The dream had ended. But not the devotion. Not yet. In 3 years' time, he would marry again. Secretly. A cousin of the Queen Lettice Knollys. A widow. A beauty. A woman who did not say maybe, but yes. And Elizabeth would not learn of it until much later. Until the scent of betrayal had already seeped too deep to wash out. And when she found out, she did not scream. She did not weep. She simply turned her face away. And she never spoke to Lettice again. But she kept Robert. Even then, even after that. Because some loves are not built on trust or truth, but on time. And no amount of fire, not even the kind that lights up a sky, can burn away what has been bound by decades of shared silence. Elizabeth never returned to Kenilworth. The castle remained. But the story ended. And the fireworks. They lit the sky that night. But not her heart. Because there are queens who say yes. And then there was Elizabeth. They called her the she-wolf who dared to touch the crown. Lettice Knollys, widow. Noblewoman. Cousin to the queen. Flame-haired and elegant. Too beautiful for her own good, and far too bold to stay silent. And on one unrecorded day in the year 1578, in a chapel where no royal eye watched, Robert Dudley married her. Not with fanfare, Not with music or fire or gold-dusted curtains, but with secrecy, the kind that burns slow and permanent, the kind that finds its way into the marrow of things. And Elizabeth never knew, not at first. She was elsewhere ruling, perhaps, or writing, or pacing before the window with the light hitting her face just right, imagining herself untouched by time, imagining her, sweet Robin, still orbiting her, still loyal, still hers in every way but name. For years she had turned down his proposals, not because she didn't want to say yes, but because she knew she could not, and she had believed, perhaps naively, perhaps foolishly, that in not marrying her, he would marry no one, that he would remain hers, as she had remained his. But men get tired of waiting, and Robert was still a man. Lettice was everything Elizabeth feared. Not in status, but in presence. She was younger, fertile, willing. She did not need to be wooed with palaces or masks or fireworks under moonlight. She simply said yes. And Robert, tired of no, took the word and sealed it with vows. They tried to keep it hidden. For months, maybe longer. The truth stayed in the dark, like all dangerous things do before they rise. And Elizabeth, in her palace, in her silks and shadows, continued to speak of Robert with the same affection, the same ownership, the same belief that even if she could not wear his name, no other woman ever would. And then someone told her, history does not record who. It was not a dramatic moment. No letter found under a pillow. No accidental sighting in a chapel. No ring left glinting on the wrong hand. Just a word. A whisper. A breath that passed between lips and tore through her like a blade. Elizabeth did not scream. She did not faint. She did not throw goblets against the wall. Though God knows, she must have wanted to. But she turned. And once Elizabeth turned, she never looked back. She never spoke to Lettice Knollys again. Not once. Not even on her deathbed. The cousin who had shared her blood, her court. Her memories vanished from her heart like smoke. She called her the she-wolf, the shame, the woman who dared, and that was the end of it. But Robert, she could not banish. That was the most tragic part. Because even then, even after the lie, the betrayal, the wedding that should have been hers, she kept him, distant, perhaps, but not gone. Hurt, certainly, but still there. She punished him not with exile, but with presence. He was not dismissed from court. He was not publicly shamed. But the distance grew colder, the silences longer, the glances sharper, and through it all, he remained apologetic. Perhaps, or maybe defiant in his quiet way. A man who had waited too long for a yes and had settled for one given by someone else. And still, he came to her. He attended her councils. He rode with her through the countryside. He stood behind her as she addressed her troops at Tilbury. He handed her gloves, offered her wine, bowed when she entered, and she accepted it all, because Elizabeth had long since learned to carry her heartbreak behind a veil of command. But I wonder what she said to herself when she was alone, when the candlelight flickered just so, and the perfume of memory drifted too close. I wonder if she whispered his name with hate, or longing, or both. I wonder if she ever dreamed it had been different, that he had waited just one more year, that she had said yes, just once, before it was too late. Because it was too late now. Lettice bore him a son, Robert, like his father. And with that child, a new weight settled on the Queen's heart. The child she had never had. The family she had refused herself. The line that would never come from her blood. She did not speak of the boy. But she knew. Of course she knew. And yet, she never unseated Robert. That's what still astounds me. Any other monarch would have cast him down, removed his lands, stripped his name from the record. But not Elizabeth. She loved him too deeply or needed him too fiercely to let him fall. And perhaps that was her greatest tragedy, that even betrayal could not kill what time had built between them. But she never forgave him. Not fully. He would never be king. He would never be husband. He would never be hers. And so they carried on, bound by silence, by memory, by the invisible string that ties two people together long after it should have snapped. She was the queen who said no. He was the man who married anyway. And Lettice. Lettice was the widow who dared to dream that what Elizabeth refused, she could claim. But she was wrong. Because she may have taken the man. But Elizabeth never gave up the power. By the time she returned, the castle no longer shimmered with expectation. The curtains had lost their crispness. The fountains no longer sang quite so loudly. And the halls echoed, not with music, but with something older. Of vieille memory. Kenilworth still stood, proud and sprawling. But the dream it once held had already dimmed. The queen was older now. So was he. And the years had done what no war, no scandal, no rival could do. They had worn away the edges of what might have been. Elizabeth came not as a bride, not even as a guest, but as a monarch inspecting the ruins of a love that had once almost lived. She stayed 4 times after the wedding that was never hers, 4 visits, each one quieter than the last, each one carrying a different kind of silence. The first visit still held echoes of fire. The second, the taste of regret. The third, a brittle civility. And the fourth was something else entirely. A kind of goodbye, disguised as ceremony. Robert had poured fortunes into the castle, a reckless, aching kind of spending. He had torn down and rebuilt entire wings to accommodate her, laid out walkways and water features in the shape of her initials, carved poetry into stone beneath windows. He knew she'd lean out from. It had never been a home. It had always been a question, one she had never answered. And now that she had aged past the possibility of marriage, past the ache of motherhood, past even the sharpness of betrayal, it became something different. A mausoleum of their almosts. She walked the gardens alone. Where once actors in silk had recited verses under torchlight, she lingered in the long gallery, where music had once swelled and faded. Her fingers grazed the carved oak banister of the staircase she had descended in white satin decades earlier. When Robert had stood at the bottom waiting, hope flickering in his eyes like a man prepared to beg. Now, there were no proposals, no plays, just echoes and wind. The servants still smiled, still bowed, still called her, Your Majesty. But they did not know, could not know, what the walls had once heard, what the tapestries had once hidden, what the floorboards had once carried. Night after night, as he paced beneath her chamber and she, sleepless, listened. No one spoke of the past. They never did. Not in front of others. But the castle remembered. There is something strange, something cruel, about standing in a place that once promised you everything, knowing that you, not time, were the one who said no, and yet, still returning, still running your fingers over stone warmed by old fire, still breathing, air that once made your pulse quicken. Elizabeth didn't come to Kenilworth for ceremony. She came to feel something she could no longer name. And Robert was there, not pleading now, not performing, but older, tired, almost tender. His eyes no longer reached for her with that wild, hungry shine, but they still searched her face, as if somewhere inside her was the woman who had almost said yes, and he was still trying to find her. They walked together as they always had, saying little. The space between them filled not with awkwardness, but with the weight of 40 years of unsaid things. Some silences are deeper than words. Some glances carry more than letters ever could. And there, in that crumbling fortress dressed in ivy and sorrow, their hearts spoke what their mouths never dared. And perhaps that was enough. Because love does not always end with marriage, and pain does not always end with time. Sometimes the only way to honor something too fragile to live is to keep returning to it, to walk its ruins with reverence, to pretend, for a moment, that it might still stand. Elizabeth never stayed longer than a few days. She would leave without ceremony, as she always did. Her carriage rolling away beneath the gray English sky. Robert would stand at the gates, hand raised, face still, and watch her disappear, as he had watched her do so many times before. And each time, he wondered if it would be the last. The final visit came in the year 1575, the same visit when the fireworks missed her window and the mask was rained out. The one where he had hoped, truly hoped. For the last time, after that, the castle remained hers in memory only. She would never return, but she never let it fall. She protected Kenilworth, as she protected him from collapse, from shame, from erasure, because for all she had denied him, all she had withheld, she could never bear to see what they once shared decay entirely. And the castle, in its strange, stoic way, protected her too. It kept her secrets, it held her history, and it never asked for more, even when the world did. Years later, long after Robert was gone, long after the laughter had faded, and the courtiers had died, and the fires in the great hearth had turned to ash, Elizabeth would still speak of Kenilworth, with a softness she rarely allowed herself. Her voice would drop, her eyes would drift, and for a moment, just a moment, she would not be queen. She would be the girl who almost said yes. They said she didn't speak for days, that the great Queen of England, the woman who had faced the Spanish Armada without flinching, who had silenced Parliament with a look, who had outlived kings, queens, traitors, and lovers, locked herself behind her doors and let the world go on without her. Robert Dudley was dead. The news came swiftly, carried by a rider from Oxfordshire, where he had been resting at Cornbury Park after managing Elizabeth's triumphant visit to the troops at Tilbury. He had looked tired, thinner than usual, pale, perhaps, but no one had said the word dying. No one dared. And yet, within days, he was gone. Stomach cancer, they say, or something like it. But no one can ever quite explain how a man so determined, so deeply woven into the fabric of power, and simply stopped. He was 55. The Queen was 60. And something in her cracked. She did not see ministers. She did not eat. She paced, or sat, or stared. We will never know exactly what she did in those hours, because for once, the scribes and secretaries were silent. There are no records of her weeping, no proclamations of mourning, no royal command to drape the halls in black. But those who saw her said her eyes dimmed in a way that had nothing to do with age, that her shoulders, once straight with authority, now curled inward, as if to protect a wound no one could see. That for all her titles, all her crowns, all her victories, she looked, suddenly, like a woman who had lost her only true companion. He had written to her before he died. A brief note. Hurried. More affection than politics. No state business. No diplomacy. Just words from one heart to another. It arrived days before the end. She read it once. Then again. Then again. And when he was gone, she took the letter and wrote across it in her own hand. His last letter. She kept it in a small casket by her bedside. Not in the vault. Not in the state archive. Not in a locked drawer hidden behind portraits of her ancestors, but beside her bed, the place where she laid her head. The place where she dreamed. The letter was always near. As if it were a piece of him she refused to let the world take. Not for history. Not for glory. Just for her. And in that simple, quiet act, Elizabeth told us everything, because for 40 years, they had danced a dance without end, a waltz of politics and longing, power and denial. She had called him her sweet Robin. Her eyes, her little dog. She had sent him away, called him back, scolded him, teased him, trusted him in matters of life and war, and denied him the only thing he ever truly wanted, her hand. And yet, in the end, when all the games were over and the curtain finally fell, it was his letter she kept. Not the papal bulls, not the peace treaties, not the royal lineage. Just this. I often wonder what the letter said. No copy survives. Historians have guessed, speculated, drawn connections between phrases in other documents. But no one knows for certain. All we know is that she treasured it, that it mattered to her in a way nothing else did, that in a life surrounded by parchment and ink, it was the one letter she would not part with. And perhaps that's fitting. Because some words are not for the record, some love stories do not belong to history. They belong to the spaces between, to the breath caught just before confession, to the letter folded and read by candlelight when no one else is watching. Some things are too true to be shared. She carried on. Of course, she had to. The throne did not wait. The court did not grieve. Ministers brought papers. Ambassadors brought gifts. And life, that cruel, indifferent beast, kept moving. But something in Elizabeth never quite recovered. She smiled less. She withdrew more. And though she would favor another man in her later years, another Robin, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Essex, Dudley's stepson, it was not the same. That younger Robin would betray her, would turn against her, would die with his head on the block. But the older Robin, the first Robin, had remained faithful to the end. And so she kept his letter, not just until the pain passed, not just through the cold winters or the long summer progressions. She kept it until she died. In the spring of 1603, when the Virgin Queen finally left the world she had ruled so fiercely, they found the letter still there, still tucked in its box beside her. Its ink faded, its paper worn soft from years of fingers brushing over its surface, and that not the throne, not the crown, not the pageants or the portraits or the legends is what remains. A woman, a letter, and the man she never said yes to. They buried her beneath the white stone of Westminster Abbey, in a tomb meant to hold one queen. But that would, in time, come to cradle two, Elizabeth, and her sister Mary, the one who once imprisoned her, who once held the crown. Elizabeth would later make eternal. But for all the grandeur of the sarcophagus, for all the lions carved in marble and Latin carved in gold, It is not the tomb that holds her memory best. It is that letter, still folded, still near her body when they found her, still marked in her hand. His last letter. There was no husband beside her, no royal consort, no blood-born heir, no ring that ever touched the fourth finger of her left hand. But there was that a piece of him, the man she would not, could not marry. And yet the man whose words she held more dearly than any prince's oath or bishop's blessing. And that, perhaps, is what this whole story has been about. Not scandal, not lust, not the red petticoat or the stairs at Cumnor or the fireworks no one could see, but the ache of restraint, the kind of love that lives just on the other side of yes, and never crosses over, the kind that does not kiss, but waits, that does not ask, but lingers, that survives not through flesh, but through memory. For more than 40 years, Elizabeth reigned, alone, by choice, and not. Her body became a symbol, her name, a weapon, her heart untouchable, and yet, behind the velvet and the crown, behind the speeches and the silks, was a woman who, once, had wanted to say yes, who had held her breath at the bottom of staircases, who had opened letters in the dark, who had walked castle corridors wondering if the door would open, and if she would be strong enough to walk through it, but she never did. Perhaps she couldn't. Perhaps she knew, far earlier than we like to admit, that she had been born to rule instead of love, that England would never forgive a queen who chose a man, not after her mother, not after the chaos of her father's marriages, not after the blood. And so, she said no, again and again, to marriage, to motherhood, to him, and in doing so, she kept her throne, but not her heart. History remembers her as Gloriana, as the Virgin Queen, as the Fairy Queen, as the woman who turned down every suitor and ruled as no woman had before, but I think, in her quietest moments, when the court had gone to sleep and only the candles flickered against the tapestry, she did not think of titles. She thought of Robin. Not the title Earl of Leicester. Not the scandal. Not even the years. Just the man. His voice. His eyes. The way he waited. The way he never truly left. The way he walked with her through fire and silence. Through war and whisper. And never demanded more than what she could give. And that was everything. When we speak of Elizabeth, and we always do, century after century, breath after breath, we must remember the woman, not just the monarch, the girl who lost her mother to an axe, the young princess locked in a tower, the queen who lived alone, dined alone, slept alone by design, by fear, by necessity, and yet always kept one letter close. Just one. Not from a pope, not from a king, but from him. His last letter, folded in her hand, like a yes never spoken, but never forgotten.